In the 20th century, there was an unofficial race, if you like, between the world's superpowers, the race for space. The main ones were USA and USSR. This is going to be a short kind of quiz to see what you already know about space exploration. And I'd like you to be thinking, well, who do you think won the space race? Was it the Americans or was it the Russians? Well, here's your first question then. What was the first signal broadcast into space? You could pause the video now, you could go and find it out. If you're in a classroom, maybe your teacher wants to pause and collect answers, or you could use mini whiteboards to all give an answer at the same time. That's up to you. Well, I think rather chillingly it was Adolf Hitler, and it was the opening of the 1936 Munich Olympics. Let me show you that.
Ich verkünde die Spiele von Berlin zur Feier der 11. Olympiade neuer Zeitrechnung als eröffnet.
He's just declaring the Munich Games open. And the Germans just wanted to show off that they were the ones who could broadcast a powerful enough signal to actually get it out of Earth's atmosphere and into space. And that signal is just travelling and travelling and travelling out there in outer space. And that's as far as we've ever been. Anything from Earth has ever been would be that signal now. Now, I'll just mention it. Well, really, I should mention at the start. If you get the year, or if you get the country, or if you get a name, that should be a point. So what was the first man-made object in space? Pause it if you want to have a go. Well, unfortunately, that was a weapon of war. That was the German V2 rocket in 1942. The V2 rocket, the idea was that it was launched upwards. It was launched on a trajectory which meant that it would fall on its target from above, and it was almost impossible to shoot down. And it would have been very effective if the Germans had been able to make many of them. It flew on a gyroscope, so it kind of went where they were pointing it. But they didn't make enough. And really what it led to was the Soviets and the Americans after the war being capable of making missiles. And unfortunately, well, what did they put on their missiles first? They put nuclear weapons. So Germans are ahead at the minute. What was the first artificial satellite? A satellite is anything that goes around Earth in an orbit, like the moon is a natural satellite. It was the Sputnik 1. And this rather spunky little satellite called Sputnik. It was launched in 1957. It just orbited the Earth until its batteries ran out, and all it did really was send down a bleep. It bleeped every minute or so, and it proved that actually you could launch something, it would stay in space, and it could communicate back with Earth. It must have been rather frightening if you were on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain from Sputnik at that point. What was the first animal in space? It was Laika in 1957. Laika was a dog found on the streets of Moscow. Very, very cold winters it was used to survive in. So they picked this dog because they felt that she could survive in very extreme conditions. And she did better than everyone was expecting. They were expecting her to last for about 12 hours. But unfortunately, there were no plans ever to return Laika back to Earth. They just monitored her health. They monitored her for 4 days, and actually they lost contact with the spacecraft that she was in before she actually died. But she will have died probably before she re-entered the atmosphere. So unfortunately for Laika, famous dog now, but sad story really, because there were no plans to ever bring her back. So this one is quite an important achievement. Who was the first man in space? Now, what was the year and what was the country? First man in space was a Russian cosmonaut, 1961, Yuri Gagarin. Yuri Gagarin orbited for about 3 days, and came back down safely. So they did have a plan, luckily for Yuri, to have him safely back onto Earth. Just pause a minute. Who do you think is ahead at this point in the space race? Who was the first then to walk in space? Who was the first person to leave the confines of a spacecraft and actually be free floating around in space? Russian again. Alexei Leonov in 1965. Okay, I don't think that he had any special mission, but of course it was an important mission because you may have to repair your spacecraft when you are out in space. Maybe you will have seen the film Gravity. It's quite a frightening thing. It must be quite a frightening thing, especially if something goes wrong. Okay, this is probably the one you're most likely to get right. Who was the first man on the moon? American. 1969, Neil Armstrong was the first man. Bonus point if you've put down Buzz Aldrin as well.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Oh, that looks beautiful to me, Neil. It has a stark beauty all its own. It's like much of the high desert of the United States. It's different, but it's very pretty out here.
The Western world.
Every precious minute of their 2.5 hours on the surface was programmed. Rock and soil samples were to be collected, photographs taken, experiments set up to catch unfiltered particles from the sun, to record moonquakes, to measure precisely by laser beam reflection the exact distance between moon and Earth.
Columbia, this is Houston, AOS, over. Houston, Columbia, high gain, over. Roger, the EVA is progressing beautifully. They're setting up the flag now. I guess you're about the only person around that doesn't have TV coverage of the scene.
Amazing. Must have been absolutely amazing to have seen on the TV, but to actually have done it or been a part of it. Wow, fantastic. Definitely no small feat, and still no small feat actually. So, who do you think won the space race? And just think about that achievement for a moment. Just think about how difficult a place to get to that is. And I think people don't really realise how difficult it is because they're often used to seeing diagrams like the one I've shown here, with the Earth quite large and the moon quite near to Earth. Really looks like a bit of a scoosh, yeah, a little bit longer than a transatlantic flight, but not too bad. No, it's actually a 3-day ride just to get there. And then they had 12 hours of landing, about 2.5 hours on the ground, and about 12 hours getting back and redocking, and then another 3 days to come home. So all told, it's a week-long mission. It's actually equivalent to having travelled around the circumference of the Earth, around the equator, 10 times. It's actually pretty far. And so you think the speeds they would have to go at to actually get there in 3 days, that's a massive velocity. So diagrams like this are quite misleading, and it actually took building the most powerful machine ever made, the Saturn V rocket. That's this famous rocket over here on the right of the screen. Absolutely incredible thing. 30 million newtons of thrust. 30 million newtons of thrust. Absolutely incredible. And just this small bit that actually got there and a small part that came back. Now, one of the things that is often forgotten about the Apollo 11 mission, the first mission to the moon, was the third man. We all know Neil Armstrong and we all know Buzz Aldrin, but who else went? There was somebody who stayed in the spacecraft module, did not go on the lander and did not get to walk on the moon. His name was Mike Collins. Mike Collins watched the lunar lander gradually descend down to the moon, and then he stayed in orbit and he recoupled the module that returned to the spacecraft, and then he helped pilot the craft home. And he took this photo with the small camera that he took with him. And this is one of the most incredible and memorable photos in history ever. In a time when we take thousands of photos every year, every individual of us, this photo is absolutely incredible. And Mike Collins, when he got home and developed this photo, he looked at it and it made him feel incredibly, incredibly sad. Not because he hadn't been one of the people that landed on the moon, not because he thought, well, people aren't going to know my name, because they did at the time. He was a very famous man straight away. But he said, when he took the photo, he had such an incredible feeling of loneliness. He felt like he was the loneliest person, I was about to say in the world, but the loneliest person, full stop. And that's because, he said, every single human being is in this photograph but me. Every single human being is either there in that lunar lander or on that planet, all those thousands and thousands of miles away. So where next and what next? That's what I'd like you to have a look at now. I'd like you to do some research first, and I'd like you to try and find out, what do we do now? What type of space exploration do we do? When do we send men? Or women, when do we send humans? When do we send people? Or when do we send robots? Why do we send robots sometimes, and why do we send humans at other times? What are we interested in space? Why should we care about space? Why should we spend a lot of money on space exploration? Should we? Well, you might want to find some current missions or some missions that are proposed in the future. I promise you, there's hundreds of them, and they're absolutely fascinating, each one. Thank you very much for listening.